minutes late, but I think the rain has put a little bit of a vehicle to our getting here. So today we are doing, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, study of the cancellation of the mandatory long-form census and its impact on women's equality in Canada. And I believe this is our final session with witnesses. So I'd like to welcome Leroy Stone, who's here as an individual, the Canadian Council on Social Development, and we have Peggy Talon and Catherine Scott, the Fédération Québécoise des Professeurs et Professeurs d'Université, François Nolan, a counselor and Professor Concordia University, and the Marketing Research and Intelligence Association, and that's Doug Norris and Greg Jodwin. So we're going to give you 10 minutes each for your presentations, which will be followed by a question and answer period, and at the end of today's session we'll perhaps leave 10 minutes for some committee, just some wrap-up business. So to start, could we start with Mr. Stone?
Thank you. Madam Chairperson and members of the committee, it is an honor to be invited to speak to you and make an input to your proceedings as an individual. To begin, a few remarks about my professional background. In the mid-1990s, Canada established an international lead in formally incorporating measures of unpaid work into the assessment of gender equality. I was the principal statistician behind that effort, and that effort was based on a system called the Total Work Account System, which is based upon the time-use data. Later on, after 3 questions concerning unpaid work were inserted into the census, I was the co-author of a small book entitled The 1996 Census Unpaid Work Data Evaluation Study, published by Status of Women Canada. Finally, it is relevant to note that I have served brief terms as the president of the Canadian Population Society and as a member of the board of directors of the Population Association of America. These are organizations of social scientists specializing in demography and related aspects of nonpartisan data development and data analysis. Now, you have already heard some excellent testimony, and your members have raised interesting questions. Your past hearings form part of the context of what I will now say. In trying to provide a helpful contribution to your proceedings, I have kept 2 general questions in mind. First, to what extent does the change in the design for gathering data in the census put at risk the quality and or quantity of support provided by statistical data or by data analysis for programs and policies that bear upon gender equality? Second, what are the consequences of having no questions on unpaid work in the new National Household Survey? As you're all aware, these questions lead to complex discussions. There is consensus on some points of knowledge, and there's also a great deal of speculation around other issues because the information required to resolve those issues will come in the future. I hope that what I will say will be a small contribution to the points of generally accepted knowledge and to those speculations that are fruitful from a scientific discussion context. Now, with regard to the impact of the design change on questions that have been approved to be in the census or in the new National Household Survey, there appears to be a consensus on 2 important points. First, there is almost certain to be an impact, for reasons already explained to the committee by experts in assessing the quality of census data. Secondly, we have little idea at this time concerning the extent of the impact. And on this point, there needs to be some concentrated thinking about the particular census or national survey variables which are especially important in the assessment of data of gender equality. Census variables that have been repeatedly used in indicators of gender equality include income, education, labor force participation, class of worker, and occupation. Now, in order to interpret variations in gender equality values based on those variables, it is essential within our national context to also take into account variables such as language, various dimensions of ethnic origin, place of birth, aspects of family and household status, and age. Now, when I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, which at that time was one of the leading population studies centers, and later was a professor at the University of Michigan, we had many discussions about census data. And during that time, it was understood that there are some kinds of some variables within the census that are measured with very good quality, others with poor quality consistently, and others with quality in between. Now, I would imagine that in 2011, that kind of knowledge is much more advanced than it was when I was a student. So we already have good grounds. We already have good grounds for sensing where we ought to look for strange data patterns in measuring changes over time between earlier censuses and that of 2011. Unfortunately, this knowledge will not take us very far, because as you have already heard from the experts on data quality, if we are in the presence of strange data patterns, without access to independent sources of information, we probably would not be able to assess the extent to which those patterns are affected by changes in the design for gathering the data. Hence, those leaders in any sector with projects based on data that are thought to be reliable and who learn that the available data patterns are of highly doubtful validity will be required to bring new financial and professional resources to the table in the search for independent data. I'm speaking about new resources that would need to be brought on stream after Statistics Canada has delivered the data. Within any of the relevant sectors of our society, the harnessing of the professional and financial resources to search for independent data could be a major new project that has to be put on their books at the expense of other uses of those same resources. The project could be so large that a consortium of sponsors might be required to get it started. Now, I wish to emphasize that what I've just said deals only with the context where an important stakeholder learns that the available data patterns are of highly doubtful quality. There is a strong consensus that for many uses, strange data patterns will not be found. Only the future will tell the relative frequency of good and bad situations concerning these data patterns. In this connection, we should note that many users troubled by what they feel are serious defects in data delivered to them by Statistics Canada will turn to Statistics Canada for help. Now, experts in data analysis who are well-grounded in subject matter such as income are the key Statistics Canada resources to provide that help to those users. Are sufficient professional resources to respond to users who need help going to be available from Statistics Canada as we go forward? Now, what are the consequences of a new national survey where the former census questions about unpaid work are absent? I wish to make 3 points in connection with this debate. Please study the central conclusions of the book I cited earlier. There you will learn that when unpaid work questions were inserted into the census, the authors did not think it possible or even advisable to try to estimate the total volume of unpaid work using census questions, and this for 2 reasons. First, significant elements of unpaid work are not covered, such as volunteering for organizations or unpaid inputs to a family business. Second, the kinds of questions used in the census risk double counting of time between at least 2 of the activities in question 33. So these activities need to be treated separately when you're using the census data. So in inserting those items into the census, the idea was that communities concerned with services pertaining to child care or pertaining to elder care could turn to Statistics Canada for assistance in connection with background data. Now, when I speak of concerned communities, I would like you to think of the mayor of Kamloops in British Columbia. Thus, as Dr. Felige has already pointed out, the role of the census in these areas was to provide complementary data. And I repeat for emphasis that what we are thinking about are specific services such as child care and elder care, and not the overall volume of unpaid work. The second point I would like to make in connection with this debate concerning the time use data is that where these data count only the primary activity undertaken within a given time slot by a respondent, the census question on child care provides better data about the amount of time being spent in child care. You will find evidence for that in my book. However, on listening to the hearings of the 16th, I learned that the latest time use survey has arrangements to better record activities that are situations where people are doing more than one thing at the same time. And this will be an important improvement in the time use data. My last point in connection with the debate is to plead with you to reflect upon a process in which the debate is resolved by thinking only about the needs of the federal government departments and what Statistics Canada may or may not be able to do to meet those particular needs. Traditionally, work done at Statistics Canada has had to be sensitive to at least the following three classes of stakeholders. One, the designer of a marketing or product innovation program in the business sector, the nonprofit organization leader developing a program of assistance to specific population groups, a government policy, third, a government policy or program leader that needs to fine-tune a municipal, provincial, or federal policy program to address the situations of particular subgroups of men and women in our society. Sensitivity to the widely varying data needs of these three classes of stakeholders was explained on the grounds that Statistics Canada was a national resource when viewed from the perspective of the society as a whole. At the same time, we all need to be conscious of the fact that this agency is now subject to constraints that are affecting its ability to adequately be helpful across the range of sectors that I've just identified. Some of these constraints are demographic. I'm referring, of course, to the wave of baby boomer retirements. Thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to try to respond to your questions as an individual.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stone. And we next have the Canadian Council on Social Development. And Ms. Talon, are you going to be doing the presentation?
Thank you.
Okay, in about 9 minutes, I'll try and just flag you so that you can wrap things up.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to be here today, particularly after the hair-raising drive I had from a 10-minute commute into almost a 40-minute commute this morning. I'm here along with Catherine Scott, our Vice President of Research, who is also appointed Director of the Research at the Vanier Institute. Now, as you all likely know, CCSD is Canada's longest established social policy organization. We were founded in 1920 by Charlotte Whitten. We have a long history of working collaboratively with successive Canadian governments, and CCSD has developed the concepts of some of our most fundamental social programs in the country, including EI, disability, and old age pension, at a time when Canadians needed it the most. One of our flagship programs is called the Community Social Data Strategy. This is a pan-Canadian partnership where members collectively purchase about $900,000 worth of census data at a discounted rate. Consortium members include police services, municipalities, United Ways, provincial government departments, frontline service agencies, just to name a few. Our partners use the data to respond to troubling trends in their local communities. The information allows communities to focus their efforts at the neighborhood level, making better use of our tax dollars, and targeting services that respond to the most in need. And yes, we're talking about $1 million worth of revenue for the government, and now we're at a point where we have to determine whether or not we would purchase it at all. As we've said many times since the decision was taken, losing the long-form census is equal to the government turning off Canada's navigation system. Those in government who support this decision must For over 5 months now, Canadians certainly have, and their response has been quite unequivocal. Over 370 organizations have come forward with opposition to this decision. They represent every aspect of Canadian life. There are hundreds of others who have spoken out more quietly, as they fear that there could be repercussions for their organizations if they were more public in their criticism. Over 17,000 Canadians have petitioned for a reversal of the decision. 11,000 more have joined a Facebook page. Canada's chief statistician, as we all know, resigned in protest. Opposition parties have been unanimous and vocal in their condemnation. Challenges have been launched, as you know, in the federal court. Tens of thousands of ordinary Canadians have written and called and visited their MPs to voice their concerns. Polling on this decision has been quite consistent as well, showing 60% of Canadians want the decision reversed. For so many, it is inconceivable that our government would choose to navigate the country's current and future direction without the most comprehensive source of information that is universally relied on as a tool to respond to the needs and priorities of every Canadian, doing so against the advice of experts across the country. And the experts have been clear. A voluntary survey will underrepresent significant communities such as Aboriginal Canadians, Canadians living with disabilities, and visible minorities. A volunteer survey will underrepresent the numbers and skew the service needs of marginalized communities across this country. This undercounting will be most evident at the local neighborhood level, rendering this data virtually unusable for local service planning and depriving the undercounted of the services of which they're entitled to. In essence, we will look whiter, more middle class, and in need of less government support. Despite the government's contention that it is too late to reverse this decision, we know it is not. A simple cover letter from the Chief Statistician or Prime Minister placed on every national household survey could make it mandatory. Yes, a note could make this all go away. Until the surveys reach our mailbox, there's an opportunity to restore the long form. If the logistics of implementing a reversal require time for StatsCan, there is no magic in a spring census. As Ivan Faligi has said, move the census to the fall. The most important thing here is to get it right. Why pay more and get less? This is worth fighting for, and we are pursuing every possible option to have this decision reversed. CCSD, along with 12 other organizations in the country, have launched a legal challenge in the federal court defending the Canadians' equal right to be counted. Partners in our challenge include the Canadian Arab Federation, Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, Council of Agencies Serving South Asians, Canadian Mental Health Association, and many others. You need not look far to determine where, in fact, this data is used. Each and every one of us in this room today have likely used and most certainly have benefited from this information. Let's be honest. This is an experiment, a costly one. StatsCan themselves has said that they have never conducted a survey of this scale, nor does it know if the country has anything in place to actually mitigate the unanticipated negative impacts. One thing that they do know is that there will be a significant non-response bias. That is, people who don't respond tend to have different characteristics than those who do. StatsCan says that the voluntary survey will just not be representative of all Canadians. The moral, legal, and economic dimensions of this decision just don't add up. We're selling our children's future, weakening evidence that will direct how and where tax dollars are spent, further weakening our social infrastructure at a time when we all know we need it the most. And we're doing so by discriminating against some of the most vulnerable groups in this country. I'm now going to turn it over to Catherine Scott, if time allows, just to provide some additional opening comments.
3.5 minutes left.
3.5 minutes. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address the committee. Cutting to the chase, I certainly wanted to come back and follow up on Peggy in terms of recommendations, taking into account the fact the committee is looking at the mandatory nature of the long-form census, the question, and certainly questions around unpaid work. We would urge the committee to use its powers to ensure that the mandatory long-form census is mandatory long-form is included in the long-form the 2011 census, as Peggy has outlined. As well, we'd like to put on record that we support the recommendations that the National Statistics Council has forwarded to this government in respect of the Census and Statistics Canada. As well, we would like to also register our support for the proposed amendments to the Statistics Act that would ensure the integrity and the autonomy of Statistics Canada to pursue and develop the highest quality data collection possible. And so we would like to very much support the letter, certainly that was forwarded earlier by the Chief Statistician, the former Governor of the Bank of Canada, and two former clerks of the Privy Council. It's not an exaggeration to say that the census is the foundation of our data collection systems in Canada. The decision to abandon the long-form census will certainly critically undermine the integrity of the censuses, our census as well, but also the integrity of many other surveys and data collection in Canada. It will compromise the ability of governments at all levels to pursue evidence-based decision-making and inform policy and program choices, and most especially at the community level. I'm coming today as a researcher and someone who, and I can touch briefly on some of the work that we've done at CCSD and Vanier about how we have used the census in our own work. But I wanted to actually bring forward a more personal anecdote. I've been doing research in the community sector for upwards of 20 years, and I really, truly cannot tell you the number of times I get phone calls from people across the country, from Kamloops, as Leroy was speaking, simple questions asking me how many single moms live in Campbell River, British Columbia, what types of supports are available in the communities. People, in this age are very wanting to pick up the phone. And really, I turn to the census. This is really exclusively the only source of information at community level. And this decision in particular will have an extraordinary impact on the availability and quality of data available to communities across the country. Where will communities, in the absence of the census, of this in the long form, where will communities turn to in the future to answer these questions? Will they have the expertise or the resources to pursue this information to help plan their services and the like? Will they have the ability to collect these data themselves? And I would put forward to you that they will not have the resources nor the funds to pursue this important information, that they will go without. Many, many communities will be steering, as Peggy has said, without any type of navigation tool. In looking at some of the research that we've done, certainly the census has been critical for us at CCSD in pursuing studies of urban poverty. And I can cite a number of the research. For instance, some of you may be familiar with Poverty by Postal Code that was done in Toronto back in the early, it was 2004. That particular piece of research identified new emerging patterns of urban poverty in Toronto that directly led to United Way profoundly changing their programming and setting up a neighborhood revitalization programs that are influencing policy today. Oh, sorry. Just to wrap up, I would certainly say just as we have this past number of months invested in our critical physical infrastructure, it's as critical to invest in our knowledge infrastructure. And in that regard, the census is a foundation, and I would urge the committee to lend its weight and its voice to maintaining the long-form census. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Ms. Nodelon.
Bonjour, je suis donc Françoise Nedillon du PPU. Je remercie Madame la Présidente ainsi que les membres du comité de nous donner cette occasion de nous exprimer au sujet de l'abolition du caractère obligatoire du formulaire long. La Fédération des professeurs et professeurs du Québec s'est opposée très tôt, en fait dès le début, à l'abolition du caractère obligatoire du formulaire long de recensement, ainsi que de nombreux autres...
Interrupt, we're just having some translation.
Okay.
English channel, can you hear us now?
Can now. Thank you.
English channel, okay. Good. Sorry. The Federation of Quebec Professors spoke out very early about the cancellation, against the cancellation of the mandatory long-form census, as have many other Quebec organizations that work either specifically or have a broad interest in the issue of the status of women. And I could refer to the Council of the Status of Women, the Quebec Federation of Women, the Comité des Femmes et des Communautés Culturelles du Québec de Québec, and there are more specific organizations such as the Quebec Statistics Institute, the Quebec University Centre for Social Statistics, etc., etc. And I would like to point out that there is now a coalition, a Quebec coalition for the future of the census, which is an organization composed of many of these groups. And I would like to point out the impact of this on Quebec universities. It is estimated that there are 75 research projects conducted at the present time with statistics that come from the census, and a number of these research projects deal with women and the status of women. Just to give you a concrete example of the type of information that we need, and that is available through these statistics. There is a study called Portrait of Quebec Women, which was published in on the basis of 2006 census data, and this portrait explores the status of women in 8 areas of their life: demographics, education, families, income, work, health, education, leisure, and power. And it noticed in this study that women spend more and more time in school and have higher educational achievements. However, we can see that when we get to employment, the picture is much less rosy. Women are concentrated in lower paid professions, and even though the men do more and more household work, women are still responsible for the more of this. And single-family parents are largely headed by women. Too many women are continue to be victims of domestic violence, and their presence in power organizations is increasing, but very slowly. The end of quotation. So it is not a matter of chance that university professors and students and professors in social sciences are so concerned about the mandatory census of the long-form census. Canada has been conducting census since 1852, and for the last 35 years we have been getting this type of statistical information. Women have a great deal to lose if the mandatory long-form census is cancelled in the way that it has been conducted since 2006. This opens a serious gap in the heritage of the Canadian statistics, and we will lose the consistency, the reliability, and comparability of data. And thanks to the production and systematic analysis of gender-related statistics, we have been able to demonstrate the inequality between men and women in many areas. So how will we now know, for example, it was stated in December 2007 that women immigrants from 25 to 54 years old have the highest rates of unemployment, and these rates are higher than those of male immigrants or women born in Canada, regardless of when they settled in Canada. In the same vein, how would we know what the effects of trade agreements and freer markets in Canada has had on the impact of women and female labor in Canada between 1989 and 2005? How could we look at the range of socioeconomic condition of women, the experiences of women, and questions concerning identity? All of these come from data used by Francine Descarrés, a professor of sociology at the University of Quebec in Montreal. And the programs, it is by comparing over time that the impact of programs developed to correct inequalities that we can refine these programs. University research makes it possible to have more subtler distinctions, to have time series of data, and that will lead to very subtle analysis of questions of equality and inequality between men and women, the status of women, the development of single-parent families, gender-related work issues, and many other issues. These subjects are essential that deal not only with the status of women, but the development of our whole social fabric. It is known that any statistical survey must have a reference point, and this is deemed to be 5 years in order to have valid and reliable data. And we have to look at our past and our present in order to be able to contain the future. By dropping the long-form status, we are going to have compromised data. And it is the marginalized and vulnerable populations who we know will provide very low response rates if the national household surveys as proposed becomes voluntary. So major fields of Canadian research are now at risk, and the mandatory nature of the long-form census will have an impact on the quality of the results, will increase the cost of information, because researchers will have to look to surveys conducted by private organizations. And I would like to conclude by talking about the consequences of this at the international level. When it was announced in June that the mandatory long-form census was being cancelled, there was an earthquake around the world. We can see that Kenan Previtt of the University of Columbia, the former director of the United States Census Bureau, denounced this in the prestigious review Nature in its August edition. And Robert Maca, who is the director of the IPUMS survey and International Integrated Public Use Microdata Series International, and spoke out that, and again criticized this, and said that no longer Canadian data will no longer be able to be used in this international survey, which provides collated data over 55 countries and has been collecting data since 1960, and our data will no longer be comparable. And the issue that was deemed to be intrusive concerning the question on the number of rooms, this is a question that is asked in 20 countries that are part of this international data survey, and this makes it possible to understand the situation of children and their mothers. And so the international basis, as Lisa Dillon has said, who is a professor at the University of Montreal, also makes us possible to measure the wage gap between men and women, and also to see how great this gap is from one country to another. So there are consequences for Canada and its communications with other countries. And in looking at this, considering this question, we might draw inspiration from the famous Japanese story about the monkeys. If we don't want to spread the bad news, you just see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And however, this is, if we look at the yin and yang of the situation, we can see that there will be, for every negative reaction, there will be another reaction somewhere else. And by cancelling the mandatory long-form census, women will be like the monkeys, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, and they will even not know themselves how bad the situation is. Thank you.
We'll go to our final witness, and that's Mr. Norris, who's Marketing Research and Intelligence Association.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. I want to thank you, first of all, for inviting our association to appear today before you on this very important issue. Many of our members feel quite strongly and are quite concerned about what this means in terms of their future business practices. My name is Dr. Doug Norris, and I'm currently Senior Vice President and Chief Demographer for Environics Analytics. And in that capacity, I work with many large businesses, small businesses, nonprofit organizations, and governments at all levels in using the census information, other information, to help them make their business decisions. Previously, I spent 30 years at Statistics Canada, most recently as Director General of Social and Demographic Statistics. And while there, I was a member of the Senior Census Management Team. However, today I'm here today as a representative of the Marketing Research and Intelligence Association. I'll refer to it as MRIA. And with me is my colleague, Greg Jaudoin, who is our organization's government relations consultant. MRIA is the single authoritative voice of the market and survey research industry in Canada. Our membership includes over 2,000 individual research practitioners and more than 400 corporate members, large businesses, small businesses of all types, who are users of research information. MRIA is tasked with developing and enforcing the standards for the Canadian opinion research industry, and overall we account for about $750 million a year in economic activity in Canada. Our association considers the issue of the mandatory long-form census to be of prime importance. We've written to the Minister on this issue, and I believe a copy of our letter to him will be circulated to committee members. We'll also be making available a copy of the brief here today. Our basic concern is that the cancellation of the mandatory long-form census will affect the availability of data, the quality of data, and the reliability of data, all that's considered essential to Canadian businesses and many other organizations in trying to navigate through what is becoming a very complex economy and complex and rapidly changing society. We have the baby boomers aging, we have high levels of immigration, immigrants struggling in many cases to adapt to Canadian societies, our Aboriginal population becoming an important part of our future labor market. All of these issues are being faced by businesses trying to sort this out and depend for that on census information. And although the new voluntary National Household Survey will come into play and may provide data, good data for some purposes, it is not expected to be able to provide reliable information for many purposes, and I think you've heard from many commentators on that issue. In particular, the concern with the loss of the mandatory census is the loss of our ability to track change over time. And it's often the trends that are important rather than a level of something which is of interest. It's, are things improving or are they deteriorating? Do we need a new program put in place? Do we have to modify a program? So it's those trends and also the data on small population groups and small geographic areas. Our businesses operate in different parts of Canada, in rural Canada, in urban Canada, and in big parts of the large CMAs. Toronto is by no means a homogeneous. Ottawa is not homogeneous. And our businesses need to understand the local population around, for example, a store or other operation that they engage in. And that population is changing as well. And it's the loss of both the trend information and this small area and small population group information that's of real concern to our members. As many others have pointed out, and you've heard this morning, the response rate in a voluntary survey will likely be substantially lower than average for hard-to-reach segments of the population, low-income groups, marginalized communities, such as the Aboriginal population, immigrants, and also high-income households will probably be hard to reach. So the new National Household Survey is therefore likely to lead to skewed data, and this will give rise to doubts about the accuracy. And unfortunately, we just won't know which of the data are accurate. Some of it will be, and which is not. So there'll be concerns raised about all of the census information. And large sample sizes, although the National Household Survey is larger than the last census, that doesn't address the issue of bias and skewness. Although the Census Division decision will impact on many aspects of our work, I'd just like to give you a few examples of the negative impact on our association members' ability to measure and monitor trends and plan targeted programs related to women's equality. Many businesses have particular programs targeted at the recruitment, retention, and promotion of women. And in looking at those programs, they rely on census data as a benchmark, as a comparator to see how well they're doing. For example, they may compare their own workforce profile to the profile of the local labor market outside. How do they compare, and are things improving? Are they moving in the right direction? Do we need to modify our programs, introduce new programs? More generally, relevant comparisons of male-female income differences, an important indicator of gender equality, really require very detailed data by age, education, specific occupations, class of worker, and only a census can provide this information. And it's important, again, to do these comparisons at a local level. The labor market in Toronto is not the same as the labor market in northern Alberta, for example. From the survey industry's perspective, another important concern is the loss of the long-form census as a benchmark for the many surveys our members carry out. Survey researchers rely on the census data and refer to this as the gold standard of surveys in order to monitor their own surveys and to adjust their surveys to be representative of the population as they see it in the census. And we cannot stress strongly enough that without the data from the long-form census, without the gold standard to refer to all survey results, including those from the National Household Survey, will likely be biased to some extent, particularly on important dimensions such as income, education, housing, and many other characteristics. Corporate and government decision makers rely on accurate and reliable research data to help them make the right decisions and to navigate through our complex society. Measuring the trends and conditions of women and other population groups will be more important than ever as we come out of this post-recession and our economy develops. There'll be a lot of interest in how well various groups are doing as we emerge from the recession. How well will our labor market be responding to the many changes we see around us? And in the future, the lack of reliable information may in fact result in poorer decisions, lower business efficiencies, and likely increased costs for businesses as they go out and search for other information to replace what the census can't provide. And I'd suggest that overall productivity and our competitiveness may in fact be affected by the loss of this very, very valuable navigation tool. We therefore urge the committee to recommend that Cabinet reconsider and reverse its decision to eliminate the mandatory long-form census. And with that, I think I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you again for asking us to appear.
Okay, thank you very much. And so we will now head into our question and answer period. And for those that haven't been to a committee before, each group takes turns, and the first round is 7 minutes for questions and answers for each member. So we'll start with Ms. Neville.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you all very much for being here this morning. We've certainly heard opinions from a varied group of presenters, and we welcome you. My first question is for Mr. Stone. And in your opening statement, you referred to your work in preparing 3 technical papers published in the 1996 Census Unpaid Work Data Evaluation Study that you co-authored with a colleague. I think it was Sandra Swain. And my understanding is that the stated purpose of this study was to evaluate whether the census data on unpaid work is valid data and how the census data compares with the GSS time diary data on unpaid work of various kinds. I hope you'll correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm not going to go into reading it all, but it appears that the study reached 2 conclusions of interest to the committee. You said with its, and I'm quoting now, with its large sample size, census estimates will be more reliable than the GSS in terms of sampling variability for dozens of significant populations. And you went on to say further on, with regard to child-caring work, it's almost totally misleading to suggest that the GSS time diary estimates of time spent doing child-caring as a primary activity are comparable, let alone superior, to the census-type stylized question. And you go on, but I don't want to take the time to read it all. Are those findings, is your professional opinion that these findings are still valid, that you're not aware of any studies that would show those findings, which albeit 15 years ago, are incorrect?
I would certainly stand by them with the proviso that we take note of the fact that Statistics Canada is making an effort to deal with the key problem in the time use survey. In the latest cycle of the survey, they are now trying to handle what we call multitasking, like women ironing and keeping an eye on the kid at the same time. So there is improvement in the last round of the time use survey on this issue, but at the time when we wrote, it did have that rather important problem.
When you say improvement, is it sufficient to meet the requirements of providing accurate information?
At the national level, I would say almost certainly, but notice that I emphasize the case of the mayor of Kamloops, for whom the GSS is of no use.
Thank you. Okay. My question is to whomever wants to answer. Is there any jurisdiction worldwide that does not have some kind of mandatory collection of additional demographic data as existed in the previous Canada mandatory long-form census? We all know about the Finland cards, but apart from that, is there any jurisdiction?
So is there anyone able to tackle that question?
I'm not aware of any country that carries out a census on a voluntary basis. There are countries that do not carry out a census and collect that information through other means, generally some kind of registration system, which is mandatory in itself, and people have to report that information. But I'm not aware, I can't say I've canvassed the world, but I'm not aware of countries that do not do a mandatory census. The U.S. Actually moved to a new method of data collection, and they do a survey, but that survey, since it replaced the census, is actually mandatory as well.
Anybody else? No. I guess what I'm struck by listening to you here, those who are here today, and the representations last week, is the real frontal assault on women's equality that has not been articulated in the public domain by the cancellation of the mandatory long-form census and the removal of question 33. Do any of you want to comment on that? And would you agree with my observation?
I was certainly struck when this first issue first came up, and certainly when I looked at and read the survey for the new household survey, that those questions in particular on unpaid work had been excised from the household survey. And it brought to mind the real fight that had been, certainly in the women's movement at the time, back in the 60s and the 70s, and indeed stretching back to the time when Charlotte Whitten actually was president of CCSD back in the 20s, around the number of women engaged in trying to elevate the importance of unpaid work, and that was groups that ranged across the ideological spectrum to people concerned about labor market, but also unpaid caring work that women were doing. And certainly the fight for the inclusion of these questions in the census had everything to do with understanding with women's equality and making the case that women who were laboring in the home were doing incredibly important caregiving work that was not being captured in our formal economic accounts, and we can document that history certainly with the national accounts and the work of Marilyn Waring to Women's Council. And so how quietly this happened, that this one set of questions was then excised without consultation from the 2011 census, and I have been struck by the silence because it really does strike at it strikes profoundly at questions of women's equality. And while there are now new data collection and surveys such as the GSS that look at care and elder care and child care, that doesn't facilitate the ability to do the kind of far-reaching analysis around gender equality, such as certainly Leroy and Doug were talking about, that you are able to do with the census. So absolutely, I think you're correct that this has been quite striking, and the silence has been profound.
So we thank you, and we'll go on to Monsieur Denoyer.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Bienvenue à vous tous.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome to all of you. And for a number of days, we have been hearing dozens of people here who have spoken about this long-form census that makes it possible to gather important information. We are told that the census covers 2.9 people as opposed to the household survey, which covers 25,000 people. And it would be much. And we are trying to understand what's happening here. At the same time, we would be losing important data. And Madame Taillon, you have talked about comparability. And perhaps you could all answer this, both from the point of view of marketing as well as from Madame Taillon's point of view. This will be a major loss of data at all levels, including at the international level, because you've said, Madame Nodilon, that we have agreements with other countries and we compare our information to move forward on women's issues. And this is what we do in this committee. We realize that women have been working for a long time to put questions into the long-form census, and these are going to disappear. And you have said that my colleague Nicole Demers also has stated that we are now telling women, just be quiet because you're just taking up too much space. So just go back to your place. Know your place. I would like to hear what you have to say about the reliability, the quality, and the comparability of data and what we will lose. First of all, Madame Nodilon, then Madame Taillon, Mr. Norris. Thank you for your question. Specifically, when we talk about university and research using microdata, to be sure that what we are saying is correct, we have to make local and national comparisons as well as international comparisons. And I will tell you a small story that was reported when we were talking about the international impact of this decision. And here's the story. Mali, which you know is one of the poorest countries in the world, and I think it's the 135th on the list of countries on the Human Development Index, and Mali is doing everything possible, and they are going through all printing presses in the country to try to print a long-form census in order to be able to get as much information as possible, including questions on women and women's work. In other words, it's very important for a country such as Mali to get as much gender-based information as possible. And Canada, which is 5th on this index of human development, can't be bothered doing this anymore. And I think when there's a meeting every year on the status of women at the United Nations, and I can tell you that in 2008 the question was of decent work for women and the recognition of work done at home, that is care given to elders, and to the fact that around the world women generally nourish the planet. And when Canada withdraws from this type of question, this has an impact on the information that we have for ourselves, but it's also a very poor sign for other countries that are trying to improve their standard. And this is very dangerous because, for example, when we try to improve conditions in Mali, they look at what is working for women in developed countries, and this will disappear now at the international level.
When we know that we've got this sandwich generation, we've got a crisis emerging in the country around caregiving. There's a generation that's got young children and who is also, very much concerned about taking care of their aging parents. And we know that this is a fundamental issue, and it's only going to grow as our boomers age. And so to remove the questions related to unpaid work from the National Household Survey is really problematic, because we need that data more than we've ever needed that data in the country. So it's almost a backward slide. And on the issue of questions, I mean, one of the things that's really striking, we did a comparative analysis between the long form and the National Household Survey, and you'd be surprised to note that these are really the only questions that are absent. We know that because of the Francophone injunction, three additional questions were added to the short form, so now there's 11 questions there. But if you do a comparative analysis between the two, the surveys haven't changed. So the questions really weren't a problem, clearly, for Cabinet, because Cabinet decides what the questions are, except for the unpaid work questions. So to me, that's a fundamental issue and a fundamental question for Canadians and Canadian women in this country.
I make a couple of points on surveys. Certainly, surveys are very important as part of the overall information system and provide us with accurate data. Again, surveys depend on the census in order to make sure that they're accurate. However, surveys can't provide data for small areas. For example, a survey won't provide data for your constituencies. You need something like a census, which profiles your constituencies once every 5 years in much detail. Or it won't provide data for small groups, particularly in small areas. So they are certainly complementary, but they do not replace one another.
Écoutez, en 20 secondes, tout le monde, vous avez tous...
20 seconds, you all said that the gathering of information would be biased, and then you would be spending more time asking yourself questions about the data than moving ahead with your programs. And I think there seems to be unanimity on that point. Am I wrong or am I right? Yeah, that's my 20 seconds.
Very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to all of you for being here this morning and for your participation in this discussion. First of all, just a question for the Canadian Council on Social Development, very quick. Can you tell me who funds your organization?
We are funded by members and private foundations, private donors.
So could you give us some examples of some of those members?
The Donner Foundation's a funder. We've got funding from the Muttart Foundation. We've got thousands of members, individual and organizational members who fund CCSD.
Okay, thank you very much. And really just a comment for Madame Noir-Delaine. I think that it's something that's very apparent in when we talk about the number of households that are single-family households that are headed by women. I don't think that would be any surprise to any of us, since court decisions for the last 30 years have been making those decisions, and it's been something that I think all of us, certainly any of us who are involved in elected positions or have worked in any social agencies certainly have known that the decisions of the court for the last 30 years have been pointing in that direction. But I guess my real questions are for Mr. Norris, if we don't mind, and I wonder if you could talk to us about the surveys that you use now. Certainly, I've been the recipient of phone calls from Environics on a regular basis, and I wonder if you could just give us a little description of how you make the decisions on where you're going to target those surveys?
Most of our surveys are client-driven. That is, a client will come to us with a certain problem. They may, for example, maybe an American company wanting to relocate into Canada and wants to know about the population in 2 or 3 possible sites that they may be looking at. And they will ask us to undertake a survey of the area, asking questions perhaps related to the interest in the kinds of products and services that that company is offering.
Because fundamentally what you're looking for when a client of yours is looking to relocate or looking to promote a product, you're looking to find out basically what kind of disposable income might be available for a certain product. Would that be?
Well, income is certainly one factor, but it goes way beyond income because what's important is, for example, the changing ethnic mix of our population. People from different backgrounds may have different preferences in their consumer behavior. They may have different types of families, different types of households. So the interest is in the wide range of what we call socioeconomic data.
Sure. And so when you talk about male-female income data, you're really looking at you're looking at targeting a product to a certain market. I've been in business, and I certainly know about target marketing because of the service that my business provided. So that's really what you're looking to do.
Well, no, the reference I made to male-female differences was more in the context of human resource planning. Businesses are in the business of hiring, of promoting women, of retaining women in their workforce. It's very competitive. And so they're interested in, does their business represent the face of the community they're serving? To what extent is that true? And do they have to monitor that? Do they want to introduce new programs, introduce new recruitment strategies? As I say, it's a very, and becoming more and more competitive recruitment environment they're in. So my reference to the male-female income earnings difference was really made in the human resource side of things, but you're right that certainly marketing to women is an important factor as well.
Okay, and just a comment, if I may, from my own constituency of Newmarket Aurora. When I look at the changes that have happened in my riding in even the last 5 years, quite frankly, I believe that the survey data that people are using is not providing them with the information that they need, simply because I am very intent on seeing post-secondary education come into my riding, and I know that that's a provincial issue, but I'm trying to build the foundations that are necessary in order to support that. But my hospital has for the last 10 years, has had a collection agency, if you will, or a collection area for services of nearly 200,000 people. And quite frankly, the surveys have missed the mark on providing the services that need to go along with all of that. So if there's anything Environics can do to support a survey collection data. But one comment that and I brought all of this in with me. I brought all of this in with me because this is material that I regularly get in my door from any variety of marketers who are looking to sell products. And I guess my question to you is, do you think that people should be threatened with jail time or a fine for not answering a survey that is going to provide them with more of this kind of material at their door? Quite frankly, I don't think that that's I don't think that's necessary. Any comments on that?
Well, certainly the census is used by people who market, like you say. That's one use of the census. By no means is it the most application. It's used widely, as you've heard, for policy purposes, for planning purposes, by educational institutions. So that is one application. And in fact, it's interesting that in using the census, firms yes, they do want to advertise, but they're able to better target their advertisement. So, for example, they're able to cut down the number of brochures that they send out to people who probably won't be interested. I'm sure you will say you still get too many, but there's a big saving in terms of the environment, in terms of being able to target that information better. So the census is widely used.
And so why would a business not be prepared to pay for that? Should the Canadian taxpayer be providing that information without cost to a business, or should it not be a cost of business for that business that is providing that market or that product to the market?
The Canadian businesses in our association actually pay a fair bit of money every year to Statistics Canada for the purpose of using the census information. So there is a part of that census is certainly cost recovered, and businesses in particular are fairly large clients of Statistics Canada.
Thank you. And we'll go on to Ms. Matheson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all of you because you've made this very, very clear in terms of understanding what is going on and the bits and pieces, because clearly we're not the experts, but you have, I think, given expertise that will help us to come to a good decision. What's been I guess, most bizarre, interesting about all of this is the motivation behind eliminating unpaid work from the mandatory census and the changes. We know that it's going to cost about $300 million more to do this. And we've heard from a number of perspectives. For example, Mr. Norris, you talked about the economic repercussions of eliminating the long-form census in terms of lower business efficiencies, lower profitability, productivity. So it seems that that's a very significant negative. And we've heard from Madame Talon and Madame Scott about the general impact on NGOs and service providers and those people that deliver the services to our community. I come back to trying to understand what on earth is the motivation. I mean, the government, despite what we've heard this morning, has gone to considerable lengths to point out that no one has ever gone to jail for not completing a long-form census. So it's clearly not a punitive thing. And we've also heard that in testimony that the long-form census isn't perceived to be particularly intrusive. People are happy to participate, or at least there's a willingness. I mean, this collection of data goes back a long way, and you've said over and over how essential it is, how important it is, not just to marketing, but to the fabric of our society, and making sure that what is needed is what is provided. Now, a number of things struck me, and I want to pursue a number of questions, but I'll start with Madame Talon. You said, without the long-form census, our society will be whiter, more middle class, and less in need of government services. And I want to underscore less in need of government services, because the mantra of less government seems to be something that is the siren call that we've heard over and over. What are the consequences of this? Could you give me a sense of that? Because I'm struggling, again, with motivation.
Thank you for the question. You know, there's lots of theories, and we've heard them all kind of percolating. I think that one of the things that has been unequivocal is, you know, the expertise. The statisticians across the country have said that a volunteer survey will not render the same results as a mandatory survey. And there's lots of evidence that supports the fact that certain groups in Canada will fill out a volunteer survey and others will not. So the more vulnerable members of our communities, single parents, people living under a certain income level, as well as certain people living over a certain income level. We also know that new Canadians, immigrants, etc., will struggle, and they're struggling to adapt to the country. You know, filling out a volunteer survey will not be a great priority, and language is a key issue. So that's been well established by the experts in the country. There are those that, when you start to kind of think about that and you think about the motivation, is it that we're trying to paint a different picture of the country? I would hope that we're not. But we have to recognize that the census is a tool that is used to determine levels of funding transfer to key programs based on population need. So if you draw the line between understanding that and understanding what the expert statisticians are telling us in the country, we believe that there's a great risk of less money going to where it's needed the most in this country, and that's a big problem.
Okay. Did anyone else want to comment on that? Oui, madame.
Effectivement, il serait difficile de deviner.
Yes, it is how we don't have a crystal ball, so we can't know what the hidden agenda was behind this decision. But I think that the condition of lack of information that we're going to come to will be tragic. We will be blinded, and then we'll be using any kind of figure, and we'll say, okay, we've conducted our private survey, and this is what we have decided, this is what we have found, and we'll give you this figure, this is it, and there's no way of controlling that, no way of knowing what the reliability is. The importance of Statistics Canada in general and of its work, and this was highlighted, it is a non-political agency that conducted its own research without being led by the political level, and we're losing the independence of this process, and this is where I see the big gap happening.
And Madame Nourion, this government is currently negotiating all kinds of trade agreements and very proud trade with Colombia, trade with Panama, and currently an agreement with the European Union. You said that trade agreements and the free market have a very distinct impact on women. They are perhaps impacted more than others. Could you elaborate on that?
For a complicated question.
I don't want to say anything silly. However, when we talk about a simple consequence, at the international level, there are a certain number of decisions that are made, and we don't know exactly what it means. Sometimes it's just a comma or a word that is changed in a document, but it makes a big difference when we want to. And with respect to women, the consequences of the women's gains going backwards will have an impact on what happens in Italy or China or Africa, because international decisions will have been made.
And it's a 5-minute round, and we'll start with Ms. Simpsons for the Liberals. Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank all the witnesses for appearing. Every one of our witnesses has brought something very valuable to the table, but certainly not the information in terms of how very important Canadians see the long-form census and the arbitrary dropping of question 33. I think there was enough outrage about that. My concern, however, is the current government, the stunning lack of comprehension as to what the material that we are gathering with the long-form census, mandatory information. It's either that, because we have a minister who said one person in this country, one complaint, is all it takes to change public policy. So all I can imagine is there was one person that complained, and we've changed everything. You know, the fact that we have another member, quite honestly, that sees this as gathering statistics for flyers is I'm stunned, actually, that I have to sit here and ask questions about something that's so fundamental. I did want to pick up on our international obligations. And we've been hearing in the news that Canada's been taking hits all around the world for policies that they're buying into. This came about, this question 33 was specific
to a UN conference on women in Beijing, and there were 181 member nations, including Canada, that signed on to that. Signed. That indicates to me it was fairly important globally. And they agreed to start to tally and value unpaid work. Do any of you have any idea if any of the other 180 nations opted out of this survey in terms of trying to collect data for unpaid work?
To my knowledge, I don't have any information about a particular country that opted out. Having opted out, certainly different countries have proceeded to develop the indicators to track the status of women pursuant to the Beijing agreements. What was interesting, Canada, of course, was a leader in that. And in fact, through the late 90s, and Leroy was talking about it, there was an enormous investment of energy in Canada to develop equality indicators that really became benchmarks for other countries around the world. And that was true on the international front as pertains to gender equality in aid. Certainly here at home, looking at the status of children. And so really, and Statistics Canada played a critical role, and our investment in the development of data instruments of different types were hugely beneficial to not only understanding what was the conditions of women in Canada, but as the exemplars, as my colleague has pointed out, for other countries in their own data collection. So I can't emphasize much how important that was in that period of work.
Yeah, thank you. Because the government of the day was actually quite insistent. The cabinet, and we've heard testimony, and historical data indicates that the government of the day in 1995-96 pressed hard to make sure that this was included. Now, to your point, Ms. Talion, would it not make sense, because of the sandwich generation, what I really anticipated seeing was this question, in fact, expanded and enhanced and broken down, because we are seeing more and more women raising children and looking after aging and or seriously ill parents. So to have it dropped, I actually thought that it would be quite a bit more expanded. Would that not make sense to any of the witnesses?
30-second answer.
I absolutely agree. I think we do need to do more. We have to recognize that more and more families are carrying the burden of caregiving, and we need to understand, what are things that governments could do to assist those families, and we do need to know more than we do today. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay. So we'll go to Mr. Wallace.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's my pleasure to be here today, and nice to see Ms. Tallon again. I have a few questions for you. And since I only have 5 minutes, I need sort of a yes or no's to help me get through this. Based on your testimony today, which is a little bit different than the last time we talked, if in your opinion, the difference between the long-form census and the national survey is the penalties. Is that correct?
It's the mandatory nature.
Right. So to have something mandatory, you have to have penalties.
You're absolutely right.
So it is the penalties that's the issue.
The penalties signify the importance of the census, the importance of the tool, and it tells Canadians, fill this out. It's in your absolute best interest, just like seatbelts, sending your kids to school, all those things.
Okay, I got it. So we can come to the agreement then that we are sending out almost double the number of surveys, and the likelihood, even at 70% return rate, down from 95 or 98, whatever it was, that's still an additional 800,000 surveys coming in. You would agree with that math?
I agree with the math, but as I said at our last chat,
we'll try not to get into debate, so we'll just do quick questions and answers. Thank you.
So my question then to you, the response rate of 95%, we'll use that, and since we're at the Status of Women Committee, did women answer that question or answer those surveys because of the threat of the penalty? Or do you think they answered those questions because they thought it was the right thing to do?
They answered the questions because they understood that it was an incredibly significant tool, that it was mandatory, which signifies it's important and in their best interest to fill it out.
So the threat had nothing to do with it then?
I believe that they understand that there is a threat, and they are filling it out because they understand that the threat means this is very important to me as a Canadian.
So is it possible that we promote the national survey in such a way that Canadians will understand that it's important information for future policy development and so on, that they would still encourage Canadians to fill it out?
I believe you can encourage Canadians, all you want,
Right.
but we all know that the statisticians have unequivocally said it needs to be mandatory to render the results that we need. We can increase the sample, we're still going to get the same results.
Okay. Just a question maybe Mr. Norris can answer for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is testimony at this committee is that question 33, which I think is an important issue, was recommended to be removed by Stats Canada to Cabinet. You can quote me if I'm wrong on that, but my question, if you don't mind putting your old hat on for a second, would Stats Canada in previous times, when it came to the long form census, would they recommend to Cabinet what questions should be added or subtract?
Well, Statistics Canada does submit to Cabinet a request for the census and the content, and might, in the course of doing that, present certain options.
Okay, thank you. So I need to follow up for clarification. There seems to be an indication, and I don't mind, and it's a legitimate, in my view, a legitimate issue for this committee to be dealing with, question 33. But my understanding is the Stats Canada recommended it be removed for some statistical reason, and
Excuse me, point of order.
Yep.
To the best of my knowledge, we have no information that Stats Canada has recommended to the government that Section 33.
Well, I'm just saying that's my
33 be removed from.
It's my information.
So there is no information that has come to this committee on that matter.
Okay.
I would suggest that's a point of debate, and perhaps we could keep questions and answers to the witness, please.
Thanks, Lou. So, okay, how much time do I have left?
You have a minute.
Okay, thank you. So I think we're clear, in my view, that we've having a survey, we're going to have more numbers back. We are removing the threat. Do you really you believe, based on your testimony today, that having a letter attached to the front of it saying, from the Prime Minister, saying that if you don't fill this out, you could face fines, will make a difference in the return rate?
I believe that it will tell Canadians that this is the most important survey that you're going to fill out in this 5 years,
Right.
And they will fill it out because Canadians have proven that they do. They understand that it's important, and the mandatory nature tells them that it's important. It reinforces it
So
for them.
one of the questions in the national survey is, even if you do not practice your religion, what do you consider yourself? And it asks you if you're Roman Catholic, Anglican, Muslim, and so on and so forth. Do you think it's appropriate that the government of Canada threaten you with, and I'm not saying with jail time because it's never going to happen, with a fine, that if you don't feel comfortable telling the government of Canada whether even if you practice the religion, what religion you are, that it should carry a $500 fine?
Unfortunately, we're out of time for any answers, but I'm sure we will have more rounds, and perhaps some of the witnesses will want to pick up on that. So, Monsieur Ouellet, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci d'être.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for all of you for being here. I would like to say that I am the spokesperson for the bloc for public housing and homelessness, so I'm interested in poverty, and particularly the poverty of women is something that one has to understand. And in response to what Mr. Wallace has said, he is looking at the number of questionnaires and wants to rely on that. But I am asking you, will poor people and people in the street, will they answer questions that are not mandatory? I will ask you because you are responsible for this. You are looking at social affairs.
My understanding of the response rate of low-income Canadians to the census, that there's a lot of support, and certainly I think Doug could probably and Leroy could speak to this, there's an enormous amount of support that is put into assisting different groups of Canadians fill out the census at that time. That response rates, and we certainly heard last week actually at another committee with a researcher from Saskatchewan who compared his work on low-income Saskatchewan residents' voluntary surveys compared to the census data, that the rates were quite different for those groups, that in fact the response rates among low-income groups are much higher on the census, as well as it pertains to talking about their living conditions and their housing conditions in particular. That again, those questions are the much higher response rate from those groups on the census.
Merci. Donc, ça donne une chance au gouvernement.
So that gives the government, any government, an opportunity not to look after poor people, particularly when it comes to public housing. Mr. Norris, you spoke about the differences between urban and rural environments. I come from a rural riding, and I have from 20 to 23% of the people are illiterate, either slightly or fully illiterate. And I think that these people, if they're not obliged to answer a questionnaire, they won't, because it's very frustrating for them to have to write things and to have to go and see somebody. And there are also some very different questions, almost, for example, how many rooms are there? That's not what the frustration is, the fact that they can't write. So if we don't oblige them to talk about their experience, they won't share it. What do you think of that? The problem of people who are illiterate.
That people such as that who are somewhat marginalized would be less likely to fill out the census form. I would agree with you, and that they will therefore be underrepresented in a voluntary census. I think when it is mandatory, they realize that despite the struggle they have and despite their reluctance, this is important, and as a Canadian citizen, they feel they want to contribute that, and that signal of mandatory is sent to them. And as a result, they do fill it out, despite the reluctance. But without the mandatory nature, they may feel, well, let someone else fill it out.
Madame, merci, monsieur. Madame.
Thank you, Mr. Norris. Madame Naudion, do you know whether the universities and academics were consulted before the government made this decision to change the type of census? No. As far as I know, no. No, we were surprised by this. And as a scientist, the number of rooms in a house, scientifically, if you look at that, is that something really difficult, and that is an invasion of people's privacy? I also always find it strange that this question comes back. You just open any internet and you look at the land registry survey, so you see the owner and the number of rooms in a house. So that's not really an intrusive question. It really, we can see the number of rooms for each person, and this is an essential indicator of the level of poverty or of comfort in which individuals are living.
Yes.
On to next we have Ms. Matheson.
Chair, and I just want to, I know that Mr. Wallace would want this information. The 2011 Census Consultation Guide that goes out to stakeholders said absolutely nothing about eliminating the mandatory nature of the long-form census, nor did it glean any information from stakeholders about removing question 33. It's cabinet that makes that decision, and I know that Mr. Wallace would want to have accurate information.
We have a point of order first.
My question
Point of order,
Madam
Chair.
Point of order. Is this going to interfere with my time?
No, of course not. You have as much time as you want.
Thank you.
I have a copy of the presentation that was being presented, and it says by Stats Canada, it says the possibility of removing unpaid work questions from the long-form census was raised in the 2011 Census Content Report released July 20th. So my point of order is that she's saying that it wasn't in the report. I have it that it was. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And I have it in writing that it was
well, you have it as part of the minutes of this committee.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Wallace. I didn't want you to be misled.
Excuse me, no back and forth, please. I do believe our members do take some liberties, and we do know that our analysts are able to actually look at the witnesses and the testimonies from the past. So if we could keep our questioning directly to the witnesses and use their time, their valuable time appropriately, neither, I don't believe, was a point of order. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. My question is to Mr. Stone, and I wonder what technical testing and evaluation was done to assess the impact of removing the unpaid activity question from all national census or survey instruments in 2011?
First, I was not party to the process that led to the decision-making within Statistics Canada. But I hope that my memory is correct when I say that the evaluation process comprised the consultation that was done with various groups of users. The consultation process was the platform used.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. One of the interesting things, or there were many interesting things about all of this, has to do with the response of the public. And Madame Talion, you talked about 370 stakeholders, organizations that spoke out because they were so profoundly concerned. But you also said that there were a number of groups that did not speak out because they feared repercussions. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Well, certainly, we're part of a very broad network in civil society. We also have partners in the private sector, and obviously at other levels of government. And as we've been out doing work and connecting with partners, obviously this issue comes up on a regular basis. And there have been some groups who have personally to me, indicated their concerns, but are also concerned that speaking out could have some negative repercussions because they do receive funding from government or could be working on a project with government. So they've decided to stay silent.
Sort of like Match, Sexual Health, Kairos organizations like that. Thank you. Just one last thing, and I hope I have time. Marilyn Waring, her name has come up. She's a former New Zealand Conservative MP, and she was commenting on the elimination of the census, and she said in an interview, "I see this mirrored in so many Conservative governments in the post-recession period. They want to rule according to ideology, not according to evidence. So one of the most important things that they can do is to obliterate evidence so that they can operate on the basis of propaganda." And I wonder if anyone has a response to Ms. Waring.
30 seconds. I think that's an astute observation, and one of the things that people haven't come back to is that the decision around the long-form census is taking place in a broader context where a number of other surveys have been eliminated. There have been significant cutbacks at Statistics Canada. The amount of actually analysis and publication and information flowing into the public domain has been significantly reduced. I experienced that as a researcher. I know that to be the case in the public domain. We've lost the disability survey this year. We've lost a number of immigrant surveys. These are all taken as a piece that the loss and quality of analysis that we now have to make profound economic and social decisions has been compromised. And I think that's an important background and piece for you in your consideration and deliberations in this committee. Yes.
I actually moved to a 4-minute round when we promised you the full 5, so you have 40 seconds left.
Okay. I guess one last question, and I've kind of shuffled my papers around here. In terms of recommendations, I mean, obviously we're going to look at all of the evidence, but what recommendations should this committee be forwarding? And I'm thinking, should, for example, Stats Canada report back to this committee about findings post-2011 census data collection?
Sure. I think the one key one, I think that given the mandate of this committee is to have the question 33 not only re-added but also expanded. I think this is very critical. So from the mandate of this committee, I think that's a key recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for ruling my point of order out of order. But I just want to be clear to the committee. I'm looking at the speaking notes from the Standing Committee on Status of Women, November 16th, 2011. Thank you for inviting Stats Canada to speak to the committee, and they introduce who they are. And 16, November.
Excuse me.
That's their thing, 2010. Sorry, my apologies. My apologies. But
so go ahead.
Their presentation to this committee, and in it, you can look it up for yourselves. Part of the presentation is the possibility of removing the unpaid workers question from the long-form census was raised in the 2011 census content report released July 2008, and it goes on and talks about it. That's where I got my information from, and it's part of the record of the committee. So I don't mind being accused of misleading, but when it's wrong, I like to point that out. So there you go. My question is on bias for you, Mr. Norris. The issue you've talked about that, and we've heard from others too, that the national survey will now may have some built-in bias if certain groups don't answer the survey. And I would tend to agree that there's a possibility that those in the higher income levels may not be that excited about the survey. I'm not as convinced that those who are at other income levels or other statuses are going to be less likely. Now, the bias in the census previously, for example, there was, and I don't know the number off the top of my head, but there were a number of people answered the religion question that they were Jedi Knights. So there was built-in issues in terms of bias or inaccurate information, regardless of the survey being mandatory or not. Would you agree with that?
Well, there's always certain errors that come into a census for many reasons. A small number of people may, as you say, report Jedi, but the feeling of the census experts is that those numbers are relatively small, and overall, yes, there is theoretically bias. It really doesn't affect, for example, the trends in the information that we get.
Your organization, the Marketing Research and Intelligence Association, it's made up. It's an association, so it's made up of people who are in the survey business. I'm assuming, right? People who buy survey information. Like who is your membership?
Well, it's two parts. One are survey researchers who carry out research, carry out surveys and other kinds of research for governments, for private sector, nonprofit organizations, and there are also the businesses that use the data. For example, some of Canada's large and small businesses are members as users of the information.
So your members who are in the survey business, would they consider the work they do inaccurate?
No, I think overall they feel the work they do is fairly accurate.
And is it mandatory or voluntary?
It's voluntary. However, they adjust their surveys using that mandatory census in order to make it accurate. And they are concerned that without that standard to adjust to, that there will be more inaccuracy in their data.
Do they have a sort of a thumb, like a rule that they work by, that it's accurate within so many points or something?
Well, that would well, every survey has a certain inaccuracy about it because of its sample size.
Right.
One doesn't really know what will be the effect of the not having the gold standard.
So if the national survey has a bigger sample size and a bigger return rate, is there not potential for it to be more accurate?
No, the sample size is not related to the bias and the accuracy. The sample size is one aspect of accuracy, but the bias, which doesn't go away regardless of whether you up the sample size, is still there.
I agree with you. We had a presentation from another organization said that if we sent an all-English survey into a French community, the survey would be useless. And I would agree. I thought it was a lousy example because whether you send 2 in or 2 million in English surveys into an all-French community, you're going to get a lousy return. Do you not agree with that? That trying to define, building in biases into the survey is something that your organization, they try to remove the bias piece out because it automatically affects the results. Is that not correct?
That's right.
So do you have a one-sentence response because the time is up?
He said yes.
Yes, okay.
Thank you very much.
So I think we won't have time to go into another round, so I'd like to thank all the witnesses for coming and taking your time to present on this very important topic. So we'll just head straight into
We can suspend just so
we'll just suspend for a minute, and then we have about 5 minutes of just updating.